The road from Le Mans to Argentan ran straight through the heart of a dying summer. By the second week of August 1944, the wheat fields of Normandy lay brown and trampled, the hedgerows broken in places where tanks had crashed through them like impatient cattle. Dust hung in the air for hours after a column passed. The smell of diesel mingled with something older and worse, the smell of dead horses bloating in the August heat, of burnt cordite, of canvas tarpaulins that had been wet too, many times and never properly dried. Argentan, France. August 12, 1944. 11:47 in the evening. In a stone farmhouse on the edge of the town, a single bare bulb hung from a cord above a kitchen table. The table was covered in maps. Around it stood a handful of officers in dust-creased uniforms, their faces lit yellow from below. Major General Wade Hayslip, commander of the United States XV Corps, stood with his palms flat on the wood. He had not slept in 2 days. His French was still excellent, his temper still steady, but his eyes kept returning to one point on the map, a thin red line drawn that morning by a staff officer with a grease pencil. The line ran east to west, just south of Argentan. It was an army group boundary. North of that line, his men were not to go. Beyond the line, 15 miles away, lay the town of Falaise. And between Argentan and Falaise, packed into a pocket whose mouth was now no wider than 15 miles, stood roughly 100,000 German soldiers, the headquarters of 2 armies, hundreds of tanks, the veteran cadres of half a dozen panzer divisions. At that same hour, in a field tent some miles to the south, the field telephone on Lieutenant General George S. Patton's desk began to ring. What was said in the next 90 seconds would let 20,000 Wehrmacht soldiers escape, soldiers who would return 4 months later, in the snows of the Ardennes, to kill thousands of Americans. This is the story of the phone call that broke the Falaise Pocket open, the decision Eisenhower called a great victory, the decision Patton called a great mistake, and the 36 hours that decided the rest of the war. Before we continue this forgotten chapter, if you appreciate deep historical storytelling, consider subscribing to WW2 Decoded. Every like and comment helps us bring more of these stories to light. To understand what happened on that August night, you have to understand the war as it stood that summer. D-Day was 67 days in the past, 2 months and a week. The men who had waded ashore at Omaha and Utah were veterans now, or they were in graves, or they were in hospital tents waiting to find out which they would be. The bocage country of Normandy, that maze of earthen banks and hedgerows older than the kingdoms of medieval France, had bled the Allies for every mile. A fight for a single field could cost a company. A fight for a village could cost a battalion. The Germans had defended each hedgerow as though Berlin lay just behind it. Then, on the 25th of July, everything changed. Operation Cobra began with a carpet of bombs that turned the village of St. El into a moonscape. The American First Army, under Omar Bradley, drove a hole through the German line that the panzer divisions could not seal. By the 1st of August, the 12th United States Army Group had been formally activated, and a new American command stood up beside it, the Third Army, under George S. Patton. Patton had been kept on the bench for nearly a year. He had been disgraced in Sicily, paraded as a deception in England, written off by men who did not understand him. Now he was loose. Within days, his armored columns were running south, then east, then north, like water finding every crack in a dam. By the 7th of August his men were in Le Mans. By the 10th they were turning north toward a name on the map that no one had spoken much of before, Argentan. And then, on the 7th of August, Adolf Hitler made the decision that would seal an entire German army's fate. Against the advice of nearly every general in the field, Hitler ordered Operation Elititich, a counterattack westward, through the village of Morton, toward the sea at Avranches. The intention was to cut off Patton's logistical tail. The result was the opposite. The German 7th Army and the 5th Panzer Army drove their heads deeper into a sack whose mouth was already closing. Every kilometer they advanced westward made the eventual encirclement worse. By the 10th of August, 3 commanders held the future of that pocket in their hands. Field-Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, the overall ground commander, cautious and territorial, suspicious of improvisation, fond of plans drawn up in writing and delivered by liaison officers. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, 2 weeks into his job at the head of the 12th Army Group, soft-spoken, professorial, weighed down by the responsibility of an entire coalition's good behavior. And Patton, the unleashed cavalryman, theatrical, profane, restless, certain that the war could be won before the autumn rains came. Between them, on the 10th of August, a boundary was agreed. The Americans would drive north to Ardennes. The Canadians under General Henry Crowat would drive south to Falaise. The two armies would meet in the middle, but moving fast was not what Bernard Montgomery did. And it was not what Omar Bradley would let George Patton do. By the morning of the 12th of August, the pocket was real and visible to anyone who could read a map. 100,000 men. The headquarters of two German armies. Hundreds of tanks and assault guns, thousands of horses, an entire mechanized force compressed into a bag, whose neck was barely 15 miles wide. Inside that bag, the situation was deteriorating by the hour. Allied fighter bombers, Typhoons of the Royal Air Force, Thunderbolts of the United States Army Air Forces, patrolled the skies in shifts. They struck columns by daylight until the roads were lined with burning trucks and dead draft animals. The roar of aircraft engines was almost continuous. The crews inside the German tanks could not open their hatches by day. Wounded men lay in ditches because the field hospitals had been overrun or evacuated. But at the mouth of the bag, on the southern lip, the Allies had stopped moving. Hyslop, at his command post in Ardennes, had French armor under General Philippe Leclerc on his right, and the United States 5th Armored Division on his left. Both formations were rested, fueled, and combat-capable. Reconnaissance patrols had probed north of the boundary and found the country thinly held. There were Germans in front of them, but the kind of Germans who were already looking eastward, already counting kilometers to the Seine. Hyslop had picked up the field telephone himself, late on the evening of the 12th. "Sir," he said, his voice flat and tired, "I have French armor and the 5th in good shape at Ardennes. We can drive on Falaise tonight." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Patton's voice clipped. "Wait one." Patton hung up. He turned toward Brigadier General Hobart Gay, his chief of staff, a man who had been with him through North Africa, through Sicily, through the long disgrace and the longer rehabilitation, and who now stood in the lamplight with a notepad open. Patton picked up the second telephone, the one that ran to 12th Army Group headquarters. Patton was about to make the most consequential phone call of his life, and the man on the other end was about to refuse him. And what Bradley said next, he would defend it for the rest of his life. But the man who actually made the decision wasn't even on the call. The call connected. Static crackled through the receiver. Patton, when his anger was up, did not raise his voice. He lowered it. Hap Gay, listening on the extension, would record what was said. "Brad," Patton began, "let me go on to Falaise and we'll drive the British back into the sea for another Dunkirk." There was a pause on the other end. Then Bradley's voice, slow and careful, the voice of a Missouri schoolteacher rather than a battlefield commander. "Nothing doing. You're not to go beyond Ardennes. Just stop where you are and build up on that shoulder." Patton tried again. He had been at this corner of the war for 11 days. He could feel the weight of the moment in his bones. He spoke of the gap. He spoke of the Canadian stall at Hill 195, north of Falaise. He spoke of the German columns already moving eastward. Bradley was unmoved. The boundary was the boundary. The Canadians had been given Falaise. The Americans had been given Ardennes. To cross the line risked a meeting engagement between Allied armies under fire, the kind of disaster that ended careers and lost wars. He had a phrase for it. He preferred a solid shoulder at Ardennes, he would later write, to a broken neck at Falaise. After Patton hung up, Bradley made a call of his own. He telephoned 21st Army Group Headquarters, Montgomery's command. Here the historical record begins to fog. The man who took the call was not Montgomery himself. It was a liaison officer, a junior staff officer, whose name has been variously given and variously forgotten. Bradley described his concerns. He explained that he was halting Patton at Ardennes. He waited for guidance. What came back, by every available account, was not an order. It was an absence of an order. Montgomery was not awakened. The boundary was not redrawn. Bradley interpreted the silence as confirmation. Later, after the war, when historians began to dig, Montgomery would maintain that no clear request to alter the boundary had ever reached him. Bradley would maintain that he had sought authority and received it through the proper channels. The truth, as best as it can be reconstructed, is that on the night of the 12th of August, the most important decision of the Western Front was made by no one in particular, by a chain of telephone calls in which each man assumed someone else was holding the rope. In his command tent, Patton slammed the receiver down. He turned to Gay. "I don't know what they're afraid of." Then he sat at his small camp desk and wrote in his diary, by candlelight, the line he would never retract: "The XV Corps could easily advance to Falaise and completely close the gap. We have been ordered not to do this. I believe this to be a great mistake." But the order to halt wasn't even the worst of it. The next morning, the order would change again, and this time, it would send Patton east, away from the gap, with two of his best divisions. Dawn on the 13th of August came hot and clear. The Normandy sky, which for weeks had been grey with cloud and rain, had turned a hard summer blue. Along the dust roads of the front, columns waited for orders that did not come. Then a new order arrived from 12th Army Group. The short hook, that elegant, decisive plan to close the bag at Falaise, was being abandoned. In its place, a long envelopment. Patton was to send most of XV Corps east, toward the Seine, to catch whatever Germans escaped the pocket and ran for Paris. Only 2 divisions were to remain near Ardennes. The strategic theory was sensible enough. A wider net would catch a larger fish. The practical effect was that the men closest to closing the gap were now being marched away from it. Inside the pocket, the German command had not been idle. Field-Marshal Guenther von Kluge, commanding Army Group B, had been sending desperate signals to the Wolf's Lair for permission to withdraw. Hitler refused. Stand fast was the answer. The pocket would be held. There was no retreat without orders, but 2 of the men inside that pocket had stopped waiting for permission. General Paul Hauser, commanding the 7th Army, and General Heinrich Eberbach, commanding what remained of the 5th Panzer Army, began to organize what every soldier in the pocket already understood was inevitable. They would call it a fighting withdrawal. They would not call it what it was: a desperate, improvised escape, conducted at night, on roads under constant air attack, by men whose ammunition was running out and whose horses were dying in the harness. 2 corridors took shape, one after the other. The northern corridor ran through the village of Trun, the southern through the village of Chambois. Both crossed the small river called the Dives, a stream most years, but in the August dryness a series of muddy fords and stone bridges that became the choke points of an entire army's life. To the north of Falaise, the Canadians launched their answer. Operation Tractable went in on the morning of the 14th of August. It began with disaster. Heavy bombers of the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces had been called in to clear the way. The plan was meticulous. Yellow smoke would mark the friendly forward line. The bombers would drop beyond it. But by the time the bomber stream arrived, the dust and smoke of artillery preparation had reduced visibility to a haze. The yellow smoke of the friendly markers, drifting on the August wind, was indistinguishable to the bombardiers above from the yellow smoke of the target indicators ahead. The bombs fell on Polish armor. They fell on Canadian infantry. They fell on artillery positions and command posts. By the time the last bomber turned for England, somewhere between 300 and 400 Allied soldiers were dead or wounded, and the men who had survived the bombing had to climb out of their slit trenches and start the attack anyway. Tractable ground forward. It did not break through. Not that day, not the next. And while the Allied generals at 12th and 21st Army Group were debating boundaries and corridors, the men inside the pocket were doing what generals had stopped doing: moving fast. There is a tendency in popular memory to imagine the Falaise Pocket as a kind of slaughterhouse, a chaotic mass of broken units and panicked refugees, butchered by Allied air power and pinned by Allied armor. Parts of it were exactly that. The roads near St. Lambert-sur-Dives became known to Allied troops as the Corridor of Death, and the photographs taken there are among the most appalling images of the war in the West. But there is another truth, less often told, and it is this. The German escape was not, in its main columns, a panic. It was a discipline. Hauser, the old SS general, a man whose face had been disfigured by a wound the year before, who had commanded Panzer Corps through the worst of the Eastern Front, would not allow it to become a rout. He set up a system. By day, the columns hid in copses and orchards while the fighter bombers prowled overhead. By night, they moved. Tanks and assault guns, sometimes only one or two at a key crossroad, were positioned to cover the routes. Where ammunition was shortest, the gun crews fired only when a target was certain. Where fuel was lowest, the trucks were abandoned, and the men walked. His chief of staff, General Hans Speidel, would say it plainly after the war. The American halt at Argenton was the salvation of the German 7th Army. American patrols around Argenton, peering through their field glasses by moonlight, could see the columns. They could hear them. Sergeants asked their lieutenants why they were not firing. Lieutenants asked their captains. Captains asked colonels. The answer came back the same. The boundary. The boundary. They could not cross the boundary. Among the men of XV Corps, that word would echo for the rest of their lives. Among the Canadians and the Poles in the north, the answer was different. They were trying to advance. They simply could not move fast enough. At the head of the Polish 1st Armored Division stood a man named Stanisław Maciek, a soldier whose biography reads like a small history of European catastrophe. He had fought the Germans in Poland in 1939, been overrun, escaped to France in 1940, fought them again, been overrun again, escaped to Britain. Now, in the summer of 1944, he was leading Polish armor across the same kind of country, where his country had died 5 years before. The men under his command had no homes left to go back to that were not already occupied. They fought for an idea of a country. Maciek looked at the maps on the 14th and the 15th of August. He saw the gap that the Americans were not closing. He saw the Canadian advance grinding forward yard by yard, and he asked permission to swing his division wide, to drive south and east ahead of the main Canadian line, and to seize a piece of high ground above the German escape route. The high ground was called Montgomery. On the operations maps, it had a number. Hill 262. Among the men who would fight there, it would acquire another name, the Mace. Far to the south, in a barn outside the Norman village of Saint-Pierre-sur-Dives, a German colonel named Hans von Luck of the 21st Panzer Division was leading what was left of his command on foot through the night. His tanks had been lost or burned. His infantry was carrying their wounded on stretchers, improvised from blankets and rifles. He would write later, in his memoirs, of the strange silence of those nights, broken only by the drone of aircraft engines somewhere above the cloud, and by the occasional crack of a sniper's rifle from a hedgerow held by men they could not see and did not know were enemies until they fired. Post-war interrogations would reveal something the Allied generals had not known at the time. Hitler had not authorized any withdrawal until the 16th of August. For 3 full days, the men who slipped out of the pocket were doing so against orders from Berlin. They were not a retreating army. They were an army quietly disobeying its Freie in order to live. But there was one place where the gap could still be sealed. One hill. One road. One Polish division, about to be cut off and abandoned. On the 18th of August, Maciek's men began to climb Montgomery. By the morning of the 19th, the leading battle group, 1,500 men under Major Alexander Stefanovich, had reached the twin crests of the hill. Below them, on the road that ran east through the village of Kodhard, they could see the German 7th Army. The columns stretched as far as the eye could see. Tanks, half-tracks, horse-drawn artillery, walking infantry, ambulances, staff cars. 20,000 men or more, moving east in a slow, dust-shrouded river. The Polish guns opened fire. What followed on Hill 262 has been studied in war colleges ever since. The Poles, sitting on top of the German escape route, called down fire from their tanks and from the artillery that could still reach them. The Germans, who could not afford to leave the road open to such a position, turned and attacked. The rear guard of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, a name that had already left a black mark on a French village called Oradour-sur-Glane, climbed the hill on the 20th. The battle that began that morning lasted 3 days. The Poles were, in effect, surrounded. The Canadian armor that should have relieved them was still 6 miles away, stalled in country it could not move through quickly. Polish tanks, dug in among the fields, began to run out of ammunition. Their wounded lay in the chapel of the small village at the foot of the hill. Their dead lay where they fell, because there was no time to bury them and no ground to dig. A Polish officer signaled Canadian headquarters. The message was simple: we hold but cannot for long. Send help, or send orders to break out. At the Canadian First Army headquarters, General Henry Carrar passed the message to his corps commander, Lieutenant General Guy Simons. The reply came back: they are to hold. No relief was sent. The Poles held. They held while German engineers tried to flank the hill. They held while infantry of Das Reich came up the slopes through the apple orchards. They held when their ammunition was reduced to a few rounds per gun. Maciek, far to the rear, would describe their position with one of the saddest sentences ever spoken about a closing battle. We were the cork in the bottle, but the bottle had a hole in the bottom. What happened on Hill 262 is still studied in war colleges today. And what was lost, what was let through, is the part Bradley would spend the rest of his life defending. By the morning of the 21st of August, the pocket was sealed. Polish riflemen of the 1st Armored Division shook hands with American infantrymen of the 90th Division at the village of Chambois. The German 7th Army, what was left of it, was finished as a coherent force. Inside the bag, 50,000 men laid down their arms over the next several days. Roughly 10,000 more were dead. The Allied Battlefield Commission that walked the pocket in the days afterward counted the cost in metal. 344 tanks and assault guns destroyed or abandoned, 2,447 other vehicles, 252 artillery pieces, whole rows of trucks burned end to end. The smell, the men who walked it remembered, was unbearable. But there was another count, a count that intelligence officers began making more quietly, and with growing unease, in the days that followed. Between 20,000 and 40,000 German soldiers had escaped. The number is disputed even now. What is not disputed is who they were. They were not random infantry. Random infantry was lying in the orchards of the Dives Valley. The men who had walked east through the corridors of Troon and Chambois were the ones with the best chance of getting out. The experienced officers, the senior NCOs, the Panzer crews who had survived 3 years of Russia and 1 of France. The staffs of divisions whose men were nearly all gone, but whose institutional memory walked east with them. Hauser got out. So did Eberbach. So did the headquarters cadres of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, and most of the other formations whose names had been written in blood across Normandy. Patton, on the 13th of August, had written in his diary, "I believe this to be a great mistake." Eisenhower, in his memoir Crusade in Europe, would call the larger battle a great victory, but he never directly addressed the halt at Argentan. Bradley, in A Soldier's Story, would write the line that became his shield against 4 decades of historical criticism: "I much preferred a solid shoulder at Argentan to a broken neck at Falaise." The German verdict was the most damning of all. Speidel, in his post-war testimony, "The American halt at Argentan was the salvation of the German 7th Army." Field-Marshal von Kluge, who had commanded the army group whose army had nearly died, did not see the end of the battle. On the 18th of August he had been relieved of command and ordered back to Berlin, suspected by Hitler of complicity in the bomb plot that had nearly killed the Frere 4 weeks before. On the 19th, in his staff car somewhere along the road to Metz, he swallowed a capsule of cyanide. In his pocket was a letter to Hitler that ended with the line, "Show yourself worthy of your name." The war went on. The men who had escaped the pocket walked, then rode, then trained, then fought again. By September, the cadres that had slipped through the gap were back in the line, building new defenses along the western frontier of Germany, the position the Allies would call the Siegfried Line. The autumn rains came. The advance slowed. American intelligence began noticing familiar divisional designations on the order of battle. The 2nd SS Panzer, the 1st SS, the 12th SS. Names that should have ceased to exist after Falaise. In December of 1944, those same divisions came out of the Eiffel forest in the snow. Their offensive, the German offensive in the Ardennes, would kill 19,000 American soldiers in 5 weeks, and wound or capture tens of thousands more. American intelligence officers, interrogating prisoners after the relief of Bastogne in January 1945, made a discovery that became something close to legend within the trade. The prisoners they were questioning, the SS Panzer crewmen and the Wehrmacht infantrymen, were many of them men they had nearly captured 5 months before. Same divisions, same officers, same uniforms. The thread was visible, if you knew what to look for. From a phone call on a Norman summer night, to a hill held by Poles for 3 days, to a forest in Belgium 5 months later, where American boys froze in their foxholes and asked themselves how the Germans could possibly still be in the war. What became of the men who made the decisions? Montgomery was promoted to Field-Marshal on the 1st of September 1944. He defended his strategy in Normandy until his death in 1976, never publicly criticizing the American halt at Ardennes, never publicly accepting any share of responsibility for it. Bradley commanded the 12th Army Group through to the end of the war and rose, in time, to 5-star general. He published A Soldier's Story in 1951 and defended Ardennes in those pages, and to his death in 1981. Patton drove east, ran out of fuel in September, broke through to Bastogne in December, and died in a car accident outside Mannheim in December 1945. He never publicly retracted the verdict in his diary. Crerar continued in command of the Canadian First Army through the long hard winter and spring of 1944 and 1945, and retired in 1946. Hayslip stayed at the head of XV Corps to the war's end and rose, after the war, to 4-star general. Stanisław Maciek, the Polish general who had held Hill 262, was denied the right to return home after the war. The Poland to which he had given his service no longer existed in the form he had served. He took British citizenship eventually, but for years he was offered no pension. He worked as a bartender at a hotel in Edinburgh, mixing drinks for tourists who did not know that the white-haired old man behind the bar had once held the cork in the bottle at Falaise. He died in 1994 at the age of 102. The Falaise Pocket is taught now in war colleges as both a triumph and a cautionary tale. A triumph because it was the largest encirclement the Western Front would see, and because what was destroyed there, the material, the irreplaceable horses, the artillery, the trucks of an entire army group, could never again be replaced by a Germany running out of everything. A cautionary tale because of what was let through, and because of how it was let through. Not by malice, not by cowardice, by the friction of coalition warfare, by the politeness of allies who would not cross each other's lines, by a phone call in the middle of the night that nobody quite remembered making and nobody quite remembered taking. A war is won by closing gaps. Falaise was the gap that stayed half open for 36 hours, and the men who walked out through that gap, the Panzer crewmen and the SS officers and the 7th Army survivors, many of them lived just long enough to kill thousands of their own future captors in the snows of the Ardennes, before they themselves were captured at last in the spring of 1945, in the ruins of a Reich that the gap at Falaise had given an extra winter to die in. History remembers the battles, but stories like this remind us of the human cost behind every headline. If this resonated with you, subscribe to WW2 Decoded, hit like, and share with anyone who values the truth of the past.